wonder how many people wished I'd edit these intros out where I plop myself in the chair. I don't know about yourself, but myself and many others, we grew up, but we're never taught about binary conjugates of ancient beliefs, and specifically metaphysics, both Greek, Indian, Egyptian, and otherwise. We've all heard about Isis and Osiris, yin and yang, and I have nothing for or against Taoism, the principle of yin and yang, this inseparable holos, two things which are of course one. If I were asked, what are four of the cornerstones that make up the foundation to understanding ultimate reality, I would undeniably say that one of those cornerstone foundations, and of course another one would be understanding fields, i.e. the ether, of course, would be to understanding the conjugate nature of the universe. At absolutely every turn, both from macro to micro, what rules our better side and rules our weaker side is the conjugate geometry of the entire universe, which is an inseparable whole. Self and self, and a lot of people definitely don't understand this when it comes to the nuance of metaphysics of both Advaita Vedanta, original Buddhism, and term Buddhism. I talk about it a lot, but that term didn't even exist until the 16th century. There's no such thing as Buddhism back in the day, and this video is certainly not about discussing that. Gautama and Samyutta Nikaya 5.4, and I've been translating ancient Pali now for over 24 years, called his teachings Brahmayana, which means path to the absolute. That's what it means, or path to, of course, the Greeks would say the agathon. Nothing is known except through the modality of the knower. Ultimately, of course, we have this conjugate reality that permeates absolutely everything, from the most simple to the most complex. You say hate and love, Eros and Thanos, life and death. Of course, death is not the opposite of life. Death is the end of life. And of course, people say, what happens after we die? And I, of course, always respond, what makes you think you are that which dies? The conjugate reality of being, because life is not one thing. Life is the consubstantiality of spirit and matter, necessitatively so. Every ancient metaphysician, Plotinus, Numenius, Syrianus, Damasius, Proclus, Iamblichus, on and on and on. The Parmenides, Advaita Vedanta, original Buddhism. The world, O followers, is carried on by a dvainasaro, a duality. Duality of false identity. The fundamental principle of seeing self and what is not self. That thing that you see in the mirror when you brush your teeth, of course, is the consubstantial self between matter and spirit, kind of like the broadcast from the radio. And my near-perfect radio analogy, we, of course, are not that consubstantiality, which, of course, has a beginning in time. Anything that has a beginning in time, of course, has an end in time. We are transcendent to that, but, of course, through false identity and due to primordial agnosis, or avidya, or agnosis, we see that which we are not as that which we are, and that, of course, is why we suffer. I give another analogy why, of course, we go to a movie to become entranced. We become scared, or, drama or horror movie or science fiction. We want to be moved, so why does somebody, for example, cry in a sad movie? They're not actually in the movie, they're not connected to the movie. There's this projection that we wish to go on an emotional roller coaster. Well, we are in an emotional roller coaster in the identification of ourselves, the ups and downs of life. Literally, the word for samsara means to go round and round, samsarate, to go round and round, just like a roller coaster. The wise person doesn't want to ride the roller coaster anymore. He wants off the roller coaster. The foolish person, of course, loves the roller coaster. Oh, here's another dip, oh, life. You've heard this saying before. You say, oh, tomorrow will be better. I know you're having a really bad day. And that's true. But we're just talking about a roller coaster. Why are we on the roller coaster? What is the nature of this duality that we're caught up in? This conjugate duality. Now I'd like to simplify things because Mother Nature, Natura Naturans, is divinely simple. Talking about the conjugate principles of that which we are and that which we are not, and actually apply this to the facts of field theory. If we actually had aliens land from some other planet, instead of the sealiness that people have talked about before and hand signals and whatnot, I'm only using this as a hypothetical. I'm not actually talking about aliens. We could show them one thing to show that we're actually not terminally stupid. It would be this diagram. This, of course, looks like an owl's face. And it's also, too, the exact image you would see if we were actually to line out. And this diagram, by the way, is from Charles Proteus Steinmetz' book, Electrical Discharges, Waves, and Impulses. And I think it's on page 12. But this would be like the cross-section of a donut. If we're actually to do a line drawing of the cross-section of a donut, this is what we're looking at. So we're looking at the cross-section of a torus. And of course, all these dotted lines, or the dielectric lines of increasing inertia and acceleration, right here is the plane of inertia. Out here, of course, we have the centrifugal divergence of force and motion, and of course the centripetal convergence of increasing inertia and acceleration towards null point, or towards the ether. Yeah. The conjugate geometry of the entire universe is the magnetic and the dielectric. But these are not two things, they are one thing. Magnetism is the dielectric field. The loss of energy or inertia manifests as a three-dimensional force vector that creates the torus. What is the nature of a torus? When we say it's a donut shape, the geometry of the donut, if you will, of force and motion, i.e. centrifugal divergence, i.e. magnetism. Well, what is space? Space is unreal. Everything, both metaphysically and in science, and also, too, what Tesla said about space. And the only time Tesla foams at the mouth, not literally, is attacking relativity's view that space is something that does things and acts upon other things. It's completely ludicrous. We all have an idea of a one-horned horse being a unicorn, but we all know that a unicorn obviously does not exist. The notion that a unicorn does things and acts, it's completely ludicrous. Space has absolutely no properties, quote unquote, from Nikola Tesla. Space is the after effect, the volume, if you will, of a divergent magnetic field. The superimposition of the dielectric, i.e. the hyperboloid, or the hourglass shape, and the torus, of course, form a sphere. Space is unreal. There is no such thing as space. But conventionally, of course, space is real. Time is not a thing. Time does not exist either. There's no such thing as time. Time is a measure of magnitudes and their passing. Time is the number 4. Every ancient culture, and I could talk about this for probably an hour and a half, every ancient culture said time is the number 4, and that's also, too, the reason why it doesn't exist in the first 5 digits of the Fibonacci sequence, or you call the golden ratio. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5. The only number not present, of course, is 4. Anyway, let's get on to the conjugate geometry of things and have a thought. This, of course, is a magnet underneath the ferrocell, which, of course, is just a drop of liquid, 80% of which has been squished out underneath the optically flat glass. I actually have a ferrocell here. The only thing optically flat glass is, by the way, is just super flat glass. So in between this, there's just a few microns of liquid. Most of it's been squished out. You ring it with LEDs, you could actually use sunlight. I've actually got a video where you actually pour sunlight in. You put a magnetic field beneath it. You're actually able to see the constructive and destructive lines of interference. Now, what's constructive and destructive lines of interference? And of course, lines, when we talk about lines of force, and scientists talk about lines of force, this is actually what they're talking about. And of course, they weren't using these back in the day when they were talking about lines of force. They'd actually scatter iron filings over top of a piece of paper and put a magnet underneath it. Look at that, those lines. Well, why are there lines? It's the exact same reason why you actually see a pattern in the so-called dual slit experiment. Everybody asks me about the dual slit experiment. Unfortunately, the dual slit experiment, which everybody's asked me about countless thousands and thousands of times, starts out with a false supposition as to the nature of light. People say, what about the dual slit experiment? It's paradoxical. We don't understand it. I say, well, first, before doing an experiment, we actually have to understand the nature of light. The nature of light is not a wave, it's not a particle, it's not an emission, it's certainly not a wave-particle duality, and there are no dualities in nature, and light is not moving. Light is the hysteresis of the ether perturbation modality that light is. And light, of course, is a compact coaxial circuit. Compound, coaxial circuit. I'll edit that out of this video. Compound coaxial circuit. Light is not moving. Sound is not an emission. Nikola Tesla specifically said, light can be nothing other than a sound wave in the ether. Very apropos, and works on many levels because sound is not an emission. When I speak, I'm not emitting anything. I'm creating a disturbance in the oxygen and the nitrogen. The actual so-called speed of sound, yes, varies depending on humidity, on temperature, and density, whether it's cold air or hot air. Higher altitude sound actually changes its rate of propagation. But every human being suffers from the intellectual defect, and I have too most of my life, that speed implies something is moving from point A to point B, but nothing is moving in the case of light or that of sound. As Nikola Tesla once again said, light is nothing other than a sound wave in the ether. It's the rate of propagation. Yes, it's the hysteresis. It's the maximum rate of disturbance propagation of that phenomena. Anyway, here we actually see it could be a North Pole here, a South Pole here, it doesn't make any difference. Actually, I know by the coloration that since this is blue shifted, that this is the South Pole, because we actually have a phase disparity of a ratio of 1 to phi, which of course is the golden ratio. Phi is to 1 as 1 is to phi. This is also, too, when you do seed experiments, and countless thousands of people have done the seed experiment. Say, wow, I couldn't believe it when I watched your video that this works, and it absolutely does work. But we actually have this. Of course, people say it looks like an owl's face. We'll say, well, that looks like a black hole over here, and of course right here we have the plane of inertia. A magnet doesn't actually have polarities. It has the inverse of counter space. The loss of that energy or inertia manifests as a three-dimensional force vector, i.e. magnetism, the creation of space. Space is the negative image of infinity, or of the ether. The loss of energy or inertia leaves behind itself necessitatively the ancient Greek word of the Nankie. And Nankie is, of course, in reference to the Euristos Dias, or the indefinite dyad of the Absolute. The Christians, or the Judeo-Christians, would actually call this original sin. Yeah, there is no original sin in monistic monism. Of course, what people believe is none of my business. I'm not interested in talking about religion versus metaphysics, or metaphysics versus religion. The principle whereby which manifestation must necessitatively occur, that extrinsic attribute, is no different than light and illumination. Why? And I love to keep things simple, because Mother Nature, as I've humorously said, is a hairy armpit chick. No offense to any ladies out there that are like, hairy armpit chick with a hemp skirt and muddy feet. She doesn't do calculations. She doesn't, do numbers, and I'm not against math at all. She does pressure mediation. That extrinsic attribute is no different than light and illumination. Light and illumination are not two things, they're the one thing. And when we speak of illumination, we're speaking of, in relationship to the Absolute, that which the Absolute is also that which the Absolute does. There is nothing that does not have at least one attribute. There is nobody on this world, or any world anywhere in the universe, can think of anything real or even imaginary, like even a unicorn or a leprechaun, things that don't exist. Nobody can think of anything. It is completely untenable, meaning impossible, for anybody to conjure anything in their head that doesn't have at least one attribute. That includes the Absolute, because it is completely impossible. Nobody could know anything or even conjure anything. That's something actually to think about. Anyway, the conjugate nature of reality between the magnetic and the dielectric, both of which are one and the same thing. So what's the connection? What's the connection between light and illumination? What's the connection between magnetism and the dielectric? What's the connection between the existential self and the transcendent self? Because you can't polish a turd. People's like, you're fat, and they tell me this all the time, as if I'm not smart enough to know that. You're fat, you need to lose weight. It's like, yeah, this is true. However, fat or skinny, you can't polish a turd, right? I tell these people, like these bodybuilders, for example, they might take too many things to, pump their muscles up, and they might die prematurely. Of course, none of us are going to get out of this life alive, and I jokingly say to people, it's like, yeah, I show up at a person's funeral like that, they're so healthy. It's like, man, that is the most gorgeous rotting corpse I have ever seen. I mean, this is the hell. You see this? Come over here, come over, everybody. Look at this. That is the healthiest dead, rotting body I've ever seen. That's not funny at all. But we are not that. There is no purification therein. So what is the connection between the two? What is the connection between the magnetic and the dielectric? What is the connection between light and illumination? What is the connection between self and the not self? The transcendent self, the same distinction between the signal and the broadcast. The broadcast goes no further than the radio. The broadcast is the interpolation of all the circuitry and the speakers and everything else that's in the radio. The broadcast is the interpolation of the signal by the radio. That's what life is. That is what empirical consciousness is. Very apropos in ancient Greek and certain other languages like Sanskrit and Pali. Very, very meaningful on many different levels because the ancient Pali word for consciousness, vijnana, also means ignorance. Literally, vi prefixual plus jnana. It literally means agnosis. So the same word for consciousness is the same word for ignorance. Nescience, the false identity. Magnetism is the dielectric field. The loss of that energy or inertia manifests the three-dimensional force vector, i.e. the toroidal geometry of that. By the way, have you ever seen this before? We've all seen a dream catcher, right? I wonder if you can see the distinction and possible similarity between native peoples that came up with the dream catcher hypertrochoid pattern. By the way, that pattern is called a hypertrochoid. And that of, here's the hand underneath holding a little square magnet. You can actually see the hypertrochoidal pattern. Everywhere you see light, by the way, is constructive magnetism. Everywhere you see the absence of light or darkness is constructive dielectric. That's the reason why in either pole of this, pole of the magnet here, we're actually seeing blackness. Right here, the plane of inertia, there's this white bright line. And everywhere we see the absence of light is constructive dielectric. Of course, I think everybody's seen this dream catcher pattern. Let's take a look at this. I was looking at the AC current. By the way, if you actually were to look down a power pole, and this is getting a little bit more complicated, the actual field that exists between the two power lines that are actually going down the lines of an AC power system in your front yard or backyard or wherever you're at is the exact same pattern that you see over here. The same field geometry between the magnetic and the dielectric. Perfect superimposition between that which are two things which are ultimately one thing. Like light and illumination. Magnetism is the dielectric. We literally have the geometry of force and motion, inertia and acceleration, the superimposition of both. The negative image of a hyperboloid, i.e. the hourglass shape, is a torus. The negative image of a torus is a hyperboloid. That's not my opinion. That's a hardcore, undeniable geometric fact. Here we have the perfect yin and yang, perfect Isis and Osiris. What's the distinction between self and not self, the existential self, the transcendent self? What's the connection therein? What is that loss of energy or inertia? That is a primordial agnosis vis-a-vis monistic metaphysics, both Greek, Indian, and Egyptian, that leads to manifestation. That's the reason why I actually tattooed this equation. It's a discovery found by me in Plato's Republic, 509D to 511. Plato's divided line, when you actually take a line, you divide it unevenly, and then you take each section and divide it unevenly, and you end up with a proportionality of phi, 1, 1, 1 over phi, i.e. 1 over phi to the power of negative 3 equals phi cubed, i.e. 4.23606. The extrinsic attribute of the absolute, i.e. illumination, is phi to the power of negative 3 or 0.23606. Not actual number, but the extrinsic attribute for manifestation. Phi is to 1 as 1 is to phi. Everything that we see beautiful in nature is nothing other than an extrinsic multiplicative manifestation of the absolute. People say golden ratio. It's like, what does the golden ratio mean? I said, well, I don't know. It's just beauty. It's like this. I don't know where I have it at. I usually used to have it here somewhere. There's a phyllotaxis of a nautilus shell. It's usually sitting here. Someone might have taken it. But force and motion, inertia and acceleration, good and evil. What is evil? The same word for evil is excess. By the way, in languages, both Greek and other languages, specifically Sanskrit and Greek, numbers are also words. The word for evil are 666 that Christians, of course, all know from the book of Revelations, and also, too, from King Solomon, 666 talents of gold. Excess. The number of man is excess. Actually, the word 666, when you actually say it in the Greek, is exis. In Latin, it's excessius. In English, it's almost the same. Excess. Evil is excess, excess is evil. Every form of hardcore monistic metaphysics, both Greek, Indian, and Egyptian, and otherwise, say that evil is excess. Excess is evil. Excessius. I just wish people would think, I mean, that's the fundamental substrate behind absolutely everything. Self and the not self, i.e. the existential self, the magnetic and the dielectric, the conjugate vortex and 3D vectors that actually make up this hyperboloid, hypertrochoid overlay, which are you know, the inseparable one, you know, like, I hate to use the word Siamese twins, of course now we say conjoined twins, two that are absolutely one and the same thing. We're just looking, and of course human beings love to conceptualize, well, this is one thing and that's another. Over here we have gravity. There's no such thing as gravity. Gravity is point non-source mutual mass acceleration, i.e. point non-specific. You know, it's the same distinction between a light bulb and a laser. A laser would be analogous to magnetism, and gravity would be analogous to a light bulb. Point source. That's all a magnet is a point source object, because what makes a magnet is not quantitative, rather qualitative. A magnet before it becomes a magnet is quantitatively 100% identical. Then therefore, what necessitatively through retroduction can we say a magnet actually is? And you can ask this to any PhD professor of physics. So I have no idea, you know. So what therefore makes a magnet? You know, here it is before it becomes a magnet, here it is after it becomes a magnet. Well, I don't know. It's like, don't you have a PhD in physics? Don't you ever think about these things? You know, I like to conjure up in my mind the truth, the sublime truth, and the beautiful truth, and the simple truth of natura naturans, or Mother Nature, i.e. the fundamental substrate of understanding how this world works from one end of the universe to the other, because we don't have a specific truth. There's no such thing as a specific truth or a temporal truth. In other words, the truth didn't exist until so-and-so came along. The truth didn't... truth is only here, but it's not over there. You know, they teach that stuff. Our truth is the truth. It's like, no, truth must be necessitatively universal. And of course, this is the premise of Sophia Perennis. I'd like to go deeper into this further on, but I mean, I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours and hours. But think about that. Magnetism is the dielectric field. It is the extrinsic attribute of the dielectric field. Everything in life, from higher to lower, everything that we feel, sense, and experience is ultimately this consubstantial and transcendent, of course, not merely consubstantial, but transcendent, as in the case of the transcendent self, conjugate geometry that we are in, and it's the battle between, you know, Isis and Osiris, yin and yang. We could talk about that endlessly. This inseparable things that are not a duality. It's not a duality at all. There's no duality between light and illumination. Sure there is. No, there's not. There are two things that are expressed regarding one thing and one thing only, light and illumination. What the good is also what the good does. The extrinsic attribute, magnetism, is not something different than the dielectric, nor is illumination different than that of light. So, understanding this conjugate reality is a fundamental cornerstone to understanding everything in nature. This is undeniable and irrefutable. Good and evil, force and motion, inertia and acceleration, self and the not self, or it'd be the self and the consubstantial self, and of course the false identity of oneself is that which you are not, that lump of flesh and blood, you know, the meat sack that you see when you're brushing your teeth in the mirror. But why do you identify with that? What's the primordial agnosis thereof? It's no different than the primordial principle of why does light have illumination? Have you ever asked yourself that? Oh, I know what light is. Do you? Light's not an emission. Nothing emits light. Light is no different than sound. Nobody emits sound. They set up a perturbation in the air. It's once again why Nikola Tesla said light is nothing other than a sound wave in the ether. Quote, unquote, Nikola Tesla. Well, light's not an emission. It doesn't have a speed. It's the rate of induction of the hysteresis of the ether. Light is not composed of photons. There's no such thing as a wave. A wave is not a thing. A wave is what things do. Oh, I'm getting closer to light. Yes, and then you could actually, when you understand what light is, then we could do the dual slit experiment. But we don't even need to do it. Now that we know what light is, and we know it's just nothing other than constructive and destructive interference. Same thing you see right here underneath the supercell or the ferrocell. Constructive and destructive interference. That's all we're looking at. It's the fight between the magnetic and the dielectric, the yin and the yang of the entire universe. It's not a fight. Yeah, it's constructive and destructive interference. Exact same pattern, hypertoroidal pattern that we see in the dream catcher. Mother Nature is really, really simple. It's just that human beings are really, really ignorant. I'm not going to say dumb or stupid, I'm going to say ignorant. It's more accurate. Metaphysical ignorance is universal. Someone could be incredibly smart, yet extremely foolish, have no wisdom. They're ignorant as to the nature of Mother Nature. Ignorant as to the mechanics of Mother Nature, excuse me. Anyway, I'd love to talk about this endless hours, but I hope I gave you something to think about. Because when you think about stuff, then you really want to know the answers to things. You know, nature will tell you, but people generally don't want to know. It's like, well, how's this going to make me rich? How's this going to improve my life? You have to find that out for yourself. Thanks for watching.